Welcome to this explainer. You know, I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're taking on a massive, chaotic, and frankly, fascinating challenge. We are going to distill over 30 completely wild chess openings, drawn straight from our source material, into a highly structured, easy-to-understand taxonomy. If you've ever looked at a chessboard and wondered why on earth players willingly plunge into absolute madness on move one, well, you are in the exact right place. We're going to look at everything from ancient, heavily studied theory played by world champions all the way down to openings that exist for the pure, unadulterated purpose of internet trolling.
Now, the whole reason we even need this taxonomy really comes down to one poignant quote from our source material. Chess, when played perfectly, is a draw. Think about that for a second. If the absolute pinnacle of perfect play simply ends in a tie, it perfectly explains why players don't always want to play perfectly. It explains why they deliberately choose to plunge into the absolute chaos we're about to explore. They want to unbalance the board, confuse their opponent, and force mistakes. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. We've organized these openings into 5 distinct categories. 1. Classic and solid foundations. 2. Complex and aggressive battlegrounds. 3. High-risk and deadly gambits. 4. Defensive and passive setups. And finally, 5. Memes and disrespectful openings. All right, starting us off with number 1, classic and solid foundations. To get a real feel for this foundation, let's compare 2 incredibly popular but very different traditional setups for white. Take the Re Lopez. It's ancient, literally older than your grandma's favorite recipe, according to our source. It fights fiercely for those center squares and is notoriously hard for black to get any kind of advantage against, which completely earns it the nickname the Spanish torture. But contrast that with the Italian game. It's highly principled, beautifully simple, and it develops 2 pieces rapidly. The source even notes that the moves just seem to play themselves, making it a fantastic foundation for players who are building their skills. Beyond the Spanish and the Italian, we've got a whole cluster of foundational openings that give you flexibility without, making you completely lose your mind. You've got the Queen's Gambit, which seemingly sacrifices a pawn, but hey, if black actually takes it, white gets a massive development advantage. Then there's the Caro-Kann, offering this incredibly solid kingside fianchetto setup for a nice, chill game without taking on too much risk. We also have the English, starting with c4, super flexible, easily transposing to trick your opponents into playing a Sicilian. And finally, the Reti. This is literally just moving the knight to f3. It acts as a clever little wait and see move that can seamlessly shift into a Catalan or a Sicilian, totally dependent on what black decides to do. Moving right along to category 2, complex and aggressive battlegrounds. So if you really want to understand the engine driving many of these aggressive setups, we have to talk about the hyper-modern school of chess. Instead of just immediately shoving pawns into the middle of the board, this strategic approach is all about controlling the center from afar using your pieces. It's the core concept fueling wildly complex openings like the Grunfeld defense and the Nimzo-Larsen attack, where players rely on fianchettoing their bishops to exert this intense, long-range pressure. And that brings us to a really fascinating comparison straight from our source material regarding the King's Indian. The King's Indian defense is a super aggressive choice for black. You basically build a cozy little home for your king, happily let white control the center, and then just violently shove pawns and pieces down the king's side. But when we look at the exact same setup played by white, the King's Indian attack, our source material characterizes it in this highly satirical, deadpan way. The source literally states that playing the setup as white is a way to remain super woke and keep your white supremacy down. It's a perfect example of the kind of absurd, hyperbolic framing the source uses to describe these deeply theoretical setups. But hey, here is a massive warning directly from the source. If you are a beginner, or honestly anyone under a 2000 ELO rating, proceed with extreme caution when looking at the Najdorf, the Grunfeld, or the broader Sicilian defense. These are wildly complex battlefields with only one purpose: destruction. If you don't know the deep, incredibly dense theory behind these hypermodern and Sicilian setups, the source is remarkably clear about what's going to happen. Your butt will be kicked. Which leads us right into number 3, high-risk and deadly gambits. And this brilliantly illustrates just how explosive these gambits can be. Behold the wonderfully named intercontinental ballistic missile. It goes like this. Step 1, you play knight f3, black plays d5, and you casually sacrifice a pawn. After a few provoking moves, step 2 is where the magic happens. You sacrifice your knight to create a brutal fork on black's rook and queen. Taking the knight seems like the only logical option for them, which leads directly to step 3. The queen is captured, and the opponent's king is suddenly, tragically, wifeless. That single tactic is just one piece of an entire arsenal of deadly traps. You've got the Smith-Morra, widely hailed as the best Sicilian gambit, where you sacrifice a pawn for a massive lead in development. The fried liver attack is basically an Italian game gone horribly wrong for black, where white happily sacrifices pieces just to drag black's king on a literal walk through hell. Then there's the Danish gambit, which the source absolutely roasts as the untalented brother of the Smith-Morra. And finally, the Marshall attack, a re-Lopez variation where sacrificing just a single pawn yields an attack so fierce it leaves white absolutely trembling. Once these traps are activated, they really make opponents wish they had never decided to learn chess in the first place. All right, let's take a collective breath for number 4. Defensive and passive setups.
Think of these as the iron walls. Some players just prefer a slow, impenetrable pawn structure over those flashy, high-risk attacks. Take the Caro-Kann. It's extremely solid, challenges the center right on move 2, and pretty much guarantees a longer, grinding game. The Slav defense takes a really methodical approach, reinforcing the d5 pawn to maintain flexibility. On the more extreme end, you've got the Philidor. It's so passive and delays development so much that it's really only recommended if you have a super low elo. And then there's the Hippo. This setup literally involves keeping all your pieces below the middle ranks, just hiding behind a solid pawn wall, waiting for an impatient opponent to mess up.
But look, defensive setups can definitely be a double-edged sword when it comes to actual entertainment value. Our source contrasts two notoriously dull openings here. The London system is praised for being rock solid, sure, but it gets criticized heavily for being boring AF because it yields the exact same setup no matter what your opponent plays. Then there's the Petrov defense, described as dry AF. But here's why this actually matters. Top-level players use the Petrov specifically to force a draw. In fact, in the 2021 World Chess Championship, Ian Nepomniachtchi played the Petrov so much that he literally tired out Magnus Carlsen, pushing him to step back from defending his classical title altogether. Speaking of World Championships, the number 15 really stands out here. That is the astonishing number of years Garry Kasparov held his classical world champion title. But how did he finally lose it? He lost it to Vladimir Kramnik, who utilized the Berlin defense, which is a defensive response to the Ruy-Lopez. The Berlin leads to this incredibly dry, equal, and completely wifeless endgame where the queens get traded off super early. Kasparov simply couldn't penetrate this defensive wall, and just like that, his 15-year reign came to an end. It just proves that sometimes the most passive setups are actually the deadliest at the highest levels. And finally, we arrive at number 5, memes and disrespectful openings. In this category, throw all your chess principles out the window because the goal isn't really winning through strategy, it's about mocking your opponent. We have the Fool's Mate, delivering checkmate in the fewest possible moves. The Fred defense, where you develop your king early and just immediately start trash-talking. The Jerome Gambit, which the source hilariously calls a trash 700 elo mistake, where you don't just sacrifice a pawn, you basically sacrifice the entire game. The Sodium attack, played by moving the knight to a3, which is annotated as NA, making it a purely periodic table-based pun for chemistry nerds. And of course, the Polish opening, pushing b4 on move 1 purely for the sake of trolling. But the ultimate king of disrespect brings us to this absolutely wild number, 3,000. Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura popularized the ultimate meme opening, the Bong Cloud, where white outright disrespects black by moving the king up on the second move of the game. Despite playing this absurd, objectively terrible opening, Hikaru reached a staggering 3,000 elo rating on chess.com. That is a feat held by fewer than 40 people in the entire world, and he did it while actively sabotaging his own position just to flex on his opponents. So what does this all mean for us? As the source so bluntly points out, if you're a beginner, you're probably going to lose a lot of your games anyway. You can try to memorize the Spanish torture or spend hours studying the hyper-modern complexities of the Grunfeld, but at the end of the day, perfect play just leads to a draw. So the next time you sit down at the board, you have to ask yourself a serious question. If opening theory won't save you, will you choose the respect of the classic foundations, or will you choose the pure chaos of the Bong Cloud? The board is yours. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.